Chapter 86 Controlling Uncle. As Neil left the room, he was upset and in a terrible mood about the fact that his uncle would never stay away from his personal life, nor would he allow him to live his life as he pleased. David Wayner hated the Galvera family so much, he would never rest until the day he killed the Galvera blood in Neil's body and made him a submissive fool like he wanted. He had disowned his own sister when she decided to marry Neil's father. He did everything in his power to stop the wedding from happening, but Neil's mother was so in love with his father, she threatened to kill herself if David interfered with her life. Neil knew of all this because his uncle never failed to remind him of how love was a weakness that would kill you before your time. Because of his hatred for the Galveras, David had stayed away from his sister. Neil didn't even know that he had a military uncle until he lost his parents and had nowhere to go. Neil could still remember that day. 15 years ago, after he witnessed the death of his parents, he had gone crazy with fear and grief. He couldn't believe his parents were gone. He wasn't even able to give them a burial as their bodies were burnt afterwards by their killer. He had stood there watching the men in black burning his parents, and he wasn't able to do anything but shiver and cry. He hated his vulnerability then. He hated that he couldn't do anything as his worst nightmare was happening before him and was carving into his memories. With his hands tightly fisted beside him, he had sworn to kill the men who burned his parents. He hadn't been able to see the main killer's face, but the tattoo around his wrist as the man had left immediately. However, he had seen the rest of the men's faces and carved them into his memory like a code that would never erase. He had promised to kill every one of them, and he did just that with his bare hands. He had traced them down one by one after he was taken to the military by his uncle. He gave them the most painful death and enjoyed their cries of agony as they begged him for mercy. However, before he was taken to the military by his uncle, Neil had seen hell on earth. When he had witnessed his parents' death, he had run away barefoot, not knowing where to go but to his childhood sweetheart, Mimi, who he hadn't been able to find despite hours of looking around all of the estate in the area. He had wanted to run to his safe haven to cry for his loss, but she was nowhere to be found. It was like she had also left him at the time he needed someone to lean on. She vanished just like that, like she had never been there. Though she used to come to his place all the time, escorted by her nanny, sometimes he had never gone to her house, as the girl always told him not to. He didn't know the reason, but he had never cared as all he cared about then was having her there with him. He knew she was from around the place he lived in, but he had no idea which of the houses, as there were a lot of influential households in the town. She had introduced herself as Mimi, but he had never asked for her complete name. She was like a little angel, always finding her way into the Galvera household looking for him. And on that day he lost his family, he had gone looking for her only to realize he had no idea which of the houses she lived in. He hadn't been able to find either her or her nanny who used to follow her and warn her to stop running. But Mimi would not listen and would always run into the Galvera household, calling out his name like the mischievous little kitten she was. Neil had stopped his search for her the moment he stumbled upon Ella, the woman responsible for his family's death, in one of the mansions he was randomly knocking at to find his Mimi and take her away with him to who knows where his younger self was planning to run to. He had stopped dead in his tracks as he met Ella standing before the door, looking down at him with shocked surprise. Perhaps she had expected him to be dead as well, and seeing him alive had left her frozen in place. Neil had never felt so much hate for anybody like he felt towards that woman. He had wanted to kill her right there and then. He had wanted to strangle her to her death and burn her alive just like his parents had been burned. His eyes saw nothing but red and hate. His jaw was clenched tightly together to the extent he felt the taste of blood in his mouth. Xavier, I am, she had tried to speak while approaching him, but the young Neil had stepped back to avoid her repulsive touch before glaring at her murderously like he would burn her with his eyes. Don't you dare touch me, he had warned her through gritted teeth, with eyes like that of a monster. You killed my mother, and I will kill you as well. I will make sure I torture you in a way your husband's abusive nature will appear like a saint's. Mark my words. His voice, though still young, had scared the woman into backing away from him and looking down at him in horror. Neil had loved the fear he saw in her eyes and felt immensely pleased at the fact that he was able to make her back away. He would have killed her right there and then, but he realized there was no fun in killing her without torture. He had left with the promises of coming back to finish her up. But she was never there when he was ready to kill her. However, That was how he forgot about looking for Mimi and only focused on how to take his revenge. She had left him when he needed her, so be it. He didn't need anybody to console him but himself. He had walked until his feet were bleeding because he had no destination in mind. All he wanted to do was to leave Mirage Mesa and go far away from the city that took away everything from him. He had only one thought in mind: revenge. He had walked like a homeless beggar until he stumbled upon a man who introduced himself as his uncle. However, now that Mimi was back into his life, he was starting to feel the same possessiveness he felt towards her when he was still a boy, the feeling of not wanting her to be with another person other than himself, the feeling of protecting her from anything harmful. Nonetheless, he hated that feeling and didn't want to care for her, nor feel the need to protect her like he used to do in their childhood. He was no longer Xavier Galvera, but Neil Wayner. He had changed his name and surname to Neil Wayner after he was taken in by his uncle, who wanted nothing but to kill his Galvera traits of temper and ruthlessness. Having her in his life would only make her life short, because even if his uncle didn't kill her, his enemies would, just to destroy him. Storming out of the mansion where the meeting had taken place, Neil's rage continued to boil beneath his stoic exterior. He shoved his hand into his pocket and brought out a cigarette. The night air embraced him as he lit the cigarette, inhaling it deeply and exhaling a ring of smoke. He walked towards the new motorcycle he had just recently bought, as the other one had been stolen in Whispering Way Street. However, he didn't climb it as he noticed Liam approaching him. "What did General David say?" Liam asked as he stood before Neil, who had leaned against the black motorcycle to smoke his cigarette and look up at the sky that was now darkened with countless stars shimmering in the night. Without looking away from the sky, he responded curtly with a single word: "Nothing." Liam, sensing Neil's agitation, knew that wasn't it. His friend only smoked when he had so much going on in his mind, and knowing his relationship with his uncle, he could tell Neil was upset about something. He was about to press further when Jason, who hadn't left the premises, approached them with a smug expression. "What's up, Wayner? Did you have a good chat with the general about your new little girlfriend at Ivy Grove?" He remarked mockingly, with his bruised face wrinkling in amusement. Everyone knew the relationship between Neil and his uncle and how the general controls his life and everything he does. Jason had purposely brought up the girl so he could let the general do the rest. And he was satisfied to see the angry look on Neil's face, which meant he had been reprimanded by the only man that could control him like a puppet. It was always amusing to know that the temperamental Neil had someone he couldn't hit even though he wanted to. Jason had been embarrassed the day he sent that fist in the box, and his bruised face had been casted in the paparazzi with people making fun of him. Some even went as far as to make memes and gifs with his face being hit by the iron fist. That he wouldn't let slide. Did Neil think he would let him and that Mia Harrison go after this? He wasn't the kind to let things off, Jason thought as he glared at the two men who were ignoring his presence. "Ignore me all you want, Wayner. You are going down soon. Watch your back, because I won't rest until you're locked up for your crimes. And one more thing, Monday's failure will be a joy to witness because I know you will mess up again somehow." Neil felt the anger swell within him, but he inhaled his cigarette and exhaled the smoke straight on Jason's face with a sinister smirk on his face. "Go get a life, Wallace. Stop reveling in my potential failures, because you're making it seem like you have nothing better to do but to follow me around like a desperate, lost puppy and a crazy fan." Jason let out a roar of laughter and then continued to say, "Me, Jason Wallace, be your fan? I'd rather be a fan of my own crap than yours. No wonder your face looks like crap. It turns out you're fanning over your own shit. Tisk, how disgraceful," taunted Liam, who stood beside Neil with a mischievous smile playing on his face as he regarded the other man. He watched as Jason's amusement vanished and was replaced by his strong dislike for them. It seemed Liam's words had struck a chord because he looked at a loss for words before saying, "Oh yeah, says the man who does nothing but bootlick his psychopathic friend like a fool. You are a much bigger disgrace than I am, Liam Thompson. Your relationship with this psychopath will soon bring your family name down along with Wayner's downfall, and I will marvel at your downfall." Liam chuckled in amusement as he clapped his hands together, then shook his head in pity. "Is it just me, or is Jason turning into one of those women who do nothing all day but meddle in people's affairs and gossip? Tisk, are you even a man? Men don't act like you. You seem to be bored with your life." Liam clicked his tongue as he taunted Jason. Then, seeing how he wasn't leaving and was going to retort back, Liam added, "Oh yeah, by the way, how is your sister?" If I remember clearly, she used to be my biggest fan and even sent me gifts at the camp before. She's still as adorable as before, isn't she? Red hair, green eyes, just the way I like my women. I was thinking of sending the elders of the Thompsons household to the Wallace household to secure my marriage to your beautiful sister. What do you think about that, Jason? Wouldn't it be wonderful if we become in-laws? Jason's face immediately turned ugly at the mention of his sister marrying his enemy. I will be dead before I let that happen, asshole. Saying that, he turned and left, with Liam's amused laughter echoing behind him, making him hate the man as much as he did Neil Weiner. Chapter 87 His Type of Women. Why did you say that to the idiot? Are you interested in the red-haired girl? Neil asked with a nonchalant, uninterested expression as he sat in the driver's seat of Liam's white Lamborghini after they left the bar close to the mansion where they had their secret meeting. They hadn't spoken about Jason after the attention-seeker left and they drove down to the bar. Neil had asked that question now because his friend had mentioned Rain's name inside the bar, but Neil had ignored whatever he was saying about the red-haired girl, who was a friend of that daring little kitten, because he had too much on his head to give a fuck about his rival's sister. Liam, who was sitting at the back seat of the Lamborghini because he was already drunk from the little alcohol he'd had in the bar with Neil, laughed in amusement at Neil's question. When I was talking to you earlier about her, you weren't listening, but now you're curious. Tisk, worry not, dude, that pretty redhead is not my type. She's too innocent for my kind. You know the kind of women I like, don't you? He asked as if Neil was interested in his kind of women. Then he went on to gesture with his hands against his chest to emphasize his type to his friend. I like my women to be tall, quite fleshy, with huge boobs and a large ass. He slurred and then chuckled to himself when he heard Neil coldly scoff, unbelievable. Yeah, right, at least I'm having the fun of my life while it lasts, unlike you who doesn't even have a type. He muttered while unbuttoning his shirt and sprawling on the back seat to feel comfortable, while also complaining, I should be going home, but you are forcing me to go to your condo for some work. Ha, what a boring workaholic you are, man. Get a fun life instead of always working on your company and the mission. Neil ignored Liam's murmuring words, as he knew the idiot was drunk. He preferred his boring life over having unnecessary fun that wouldn't take him anywhere. General David had already carved a line into his head. He was a man on a mission and nothing else. He had no time for life entertainment or dreams of a rainbow future, where he would be settling down with a family of his own. He tightened his grip on the steering wheel as he recalled his uncle's words about marrying Davina. That old fag, he will never give up until he ruins my life. He muttered to himself through clenched teeth and then dismissed the thought as quickly as it came to him, because if he were to dwell on it, he might as well end up killing Davina before her return, regardless of her being his friend in the military. Neil drove Liam's car towards his condo as he had instructed Liam to follow him and assist him with some documents from Galvera Enterprises. He had a lot of paperwork to go through, and since he wasn't in the company where a secretary would assist him, he had told Liam to assist him for the whole night so he could be done before Monday. Despite consuming several beer bottles, Neil remained sober enough to work through the night, unlike his friend who was now slumped in the back seat of the Lamborghini, clearly affected by the alcohol. Neil glanced at Liam's grinning face in the rearview mirror and mumbled to himself, what a fool. He entertained the idea of wiping that smile off Liam's face to sober him up and help with the documents upon reaching the condo. Neil couldn't let his company fall because of his mission. He had to work on both sides to get everything to move smoothly. After his mission on Monday, he planned to fly down to Mirage Mesa for some important business meetings, where he also planned to stay there until he would forget there was a girl named Mia Harrison, who he had kissed and enjoyed more than anything. Neil had been with countless women in the past, but none of them were successful enough in making him crave their body like he now craved Mia's. He shouldn't have started the kiss if he knew it would mess up his head and make him hard every time he thought about how her breast had felt and fit perfectly in his hand, and how her soft, warm lips had tasted as sweet and as ripe as berries. It was hard to believe she was still a virgin with such an alluring body he desired to explore and touch. She wasn't lacking in anything when it came to looks, but she seemed to always dress in a way that would make her appear less attractive. It was almost like she didn't want to show the beauty she was graced with, and for some reason, he longed to see her in a dress. Too bad he wouldn't be in Zen long enough to have more of her, to do much more than just a kiss. With the thought of the kiss, Neil felt his body come to life again, and his trousers had a bulge. He cursed under his breath at the tightening of his trousers. Normally, he wasn't easily turned on, but now the thought of a mere silly kiss with an inexperienced girl was making him hard. He cursed under his breath and blamed this on the damn fruit he had eaten at the local market. Perhaps it was still in his system. Neil dismissed the thought of the kiss from his mind. Thank goodness he wouldn't be seeing her again. He had made the arrangement for her to get any dress and accessories she wanted, and he knew she would probably be playing dress-up in her room by now. A faint smirk appeared on his stoic face at the thought that she would be wearing something he had gotten for her instead of something that bastard Jason had bought. Unknown to him that none of the things he thought had happened. Chapter 88 The Sleeping Woman on His Couch. I hope you're up to something good with that smirk, Neil. I don't want to end up dead in my own car, because that's the look you have when you're planning something sinister, Liam slurred from the back seat, noticing Neil's calculating smile in the rearview mirror. Neil rarely smiled like that unless he was plotting a secretive plan of murdering someone. Liam just wanted to go home and sleep after consuming several bottles, but Neil was insistent on involving him in some task in his condo. If you don't sober up before we reach my condo, I might just have to do away with you, Neil responded casually as he pulled into the underground parking lot of his apartment. Exiting the car simultaneously, Liam trailed behind him, grumbling curses for being dragged into work. As the two men stepped into the condo, Neil was surprised to find the lights of his living room turned on with his television, which he had never used, sounding from the room. The house still held the lingering, enticing aroma of food, and he immediately remembered he had a certain someone cook for him in the afternoon and even told her to wait for him to return. He hadn't actually meant to tell her to wait. He had spoken those words in the heat of the moment after their kiss. But judging from the sound of the television and the light in his living room, it seemed Mia was still waiting for him to return, regardless of the late hours of the night. It was already way past 11 p.m. She wouldn't be waiting for him, would she? He thought as he took out the gun tucked behind his trousers, in case it was a trap and it wasn't Mia but someone trying to give him a surprise attack in his own house. Neil had once had a time in his main mansion when he had been attacked by surprise when he arrived home to find his lights on. He wouldn't want to risk that again, thus he signaled for Liam, who was about to comment on why he was pulling out a gun, to stay quiet. Neil was certain that Mia wouldn't wait for him until this late, because the last time he had brought her to his house and they ended up falling asleep, she had begged him to drive her home as she didn't want her mother to worry. As Neil took careful steps towards the living room, where the television was showcasing a drama series on the big screen, Liam followed his nose towards the kitchen where he was perceiving the sweet aroma of food. Neil, on the other hand, raised his gun as he stepped into the living room, only to stop dead in his tracks at the scene he was greeted with. His eyebrows slightly rose in disbelief as he slowly put his gun away and took in the sight of the woman curled up on his couch with her head resting on her hand. She was fast asleep with her lips slightly parted. Neil's heart involuntarily softened at the sight. Foolish girl, who told her to wait for him just because he told her to. He hadn't meant it, but the silly girl waited. She never followed the orders he meant for her to follow, but now that he didn't mean it, she had followed it like an obedient kitten. She looked so innocent and small on his couch, and it made it look like a scene where a husband had come home late to his wife fast asleep, waiting for his return. However, he scoffed at the stupid thought. Not in this lifetime. A frown was quick to settle on his face when Mia suddenly shifted in her sleep. How could she fall asleep so comfortably without feeling the presence in the house? Now that he looked closely, she was even drooling on her hand. Neil thought as he stood rooted in place, staring down at the unladylike, sleeping woman on his couch. She was breathing steadily with her chest rising and falling in a peaceful rhythm. Her shirt had slightly lifted up, revealing her flat stomach. Even her shirt's neckline had lowered because of her sleeping position, making the swells of her breast peek from the open top of the shirt. She looked so comfortable sleeping there. Neil suddenly felt his throat go dry as he found himself looking in that direction. How stupid of this girl to sleep without a care, knowing she wasn't in her home but in his. Neil jerked his eyes away from her chest and walked towards her. He bent down and pulled her shirt to cover her stomach, then he poked her shoulder. Hey, wake up. He frowned when she hid his hand away and turned around on the couch, murmuring some words under her breath as if displeased that she was being disturbed in her sleep. However, turning around only gave him a clear view of her rounded ass that was thrust backwards towards his direction. He took in the sight in pure male admiration. She wasn't just full in the front, but also full behind. He suddenly felt his hands itch to touch her thrusted ass, but he held himself back and cursed under his breath before poking her shoulder again. "Harrison, get the fuck up," he gritted in annoyance, with his voice sounding a bit strained and rough. Nonetheless, the girl didn't even react this time and continued to sleep as if the poking on her shoulder was nothing. Neil frowned. Crouching down before the couch, he grabbed both her shoulders, planning to shake her awake. But before he could do so, Mia had turned around again and hugged his arm to her chest with a smile on her sleeping face. "Come here, Robbie, let's sleep together," she muttered while cuddling his arm to her soft, ample breasts, believing it to be her nosy, stubborn cat. Neil froze in his crouching position with his right arm being hugged. He could pull his arm away from her if he wanted to, but surprisingly, he didn't want to. He liked the feel of being close to her in such an intimate way. Her slender arms wrapped around his muscular one made him feel a warm sensation in his chest, a feeling that was completely foreign to him. The possessive instinct from this afternoon after kissing her swelled even more inside him and made him want to keep her and mark her as his little, adorable kitten. She was sleeping so peacefully, he couldn't find it in his heart to pull away from her. And instead, he found himself staring at her. Seeing how her hair was covering half of her face, he raised his other hand and tucked away the strands behind her ears. As Neil was staring calmly at the girl on his couch and made no attempt in pulling away, Liam emerged from the kitchen and entered the living room, his mouth full of food and his hands carrying the insulated container that Mia had packed Neil's meal in. Liam intended to inquire about the person responsible for cooking the delicious food and how it ended up in the kitchen, a space he had never used before. However, his curiosity was halted when he caught sight of Neil crouching before a sleeping woman on the couch, his arm buried against her chest. Liam quickly swallowed his food and rubbed his eyes with his hands to check if he was dreaming. His eyes widened as he witnessed Neil gently brushing the woman's hair away and even caressing her cheek. In all the years of their friendship, Liam had never witnessed this tender side of Neil. Neil had never allowed any woman to enter his living space, let alone touch him. Yet here was a woman on his couch, and Neil was even tenderly touching her cheek. His friend, who had once strangled a woman when she dared touch his arm without permission, was now allowing a woman to hold him. Had Liam stumbled upon the wrong scene, or was he hallucinating due to intoxication? Wait, why did the woman look familiar? Wasn't she the same woman Neil had asked him to investigate, Mia Harrison from Whispering Way? What was she doing in Neil's condominium, sleeping on his couch? What in the world? Liam began to speak, but Neil's voice cut him off. "Shut up, can't you see she's sleeping?" He turned over his shoulder, only to see Liam holding the insulated container that was most likely containing the meal the girl had cooked for him. His eyes darkened slightly as he looked from the container to the man holding it, with a spoon in hand. For some reason, he didn't like that even his friend was eating something made by his little kitten. She had cooked that for him and nobody else. He hadn't even eaten it yet, and this stupid friend of his was already eating and clutching the container to his chest as he noticed Neil's eyes darken. Didn't he know that he didn't like sharing anything that was his with anyone, regardless of how close they were? Did she cook this food? Liam gestured towards the sleeping girl and lifted the food up in question. He had never eaten any homemade meal as delicious as this one, and even though he could see that Neil didn't seem pleased with him eating the food, he ate another mouthful and was about to sit down on the other couch when Neil spoke again. "Eat another spoon from that food, and I will fucking make sure it's the last meal you'll ever eat in your life," he warned calmly, his voice laced with a sinister tone that made Liam stop in his action of taking another spoonful. Chapter 89. Why is she here? Liam stopped in his action upon hearing Neil's words. The last meal of his life? He quickly dropped the insulated container and covered it up, then cleared his voice. "What's so special about the food that you can't even share with your buddy?" he muttered while looking at the sleeping woman on the couch. "Why is she here, Neil?" he asked with a frown. Liam had asked because he knew how his friend never went against protocols in his mission, but now he seemed to have broken one by allowing someone from the school he was to stay in disguise until he uncovered the rat into his disguised home. The military was very strict when it comes to their mission, and Neil was more aware of that than any of them because he was one of the major generals. Earlier in the evening, Liam hadn't been surprised when Jason brought up the girl in the meeting room because he knew better than anyone how his friend would never let his little curiosity about some girl in Whispering Way grow to an interest. But now that he was seeing things for himself, it seemed Neil had indeed grown some interest in the girl. That wouldn't be good for either Neil or the girl if General David were to confirm that indeed his nephew had gotten interested in some girl for the very first time on his mission. Not to mention he was betrothed to Davina, who Liam thought was a perfect match for his friend than any other woman. Davina wasn't only beautiful but intelligent. She had been with Neil long enough for a normal man to sense her affection for him. But his friend's EQ was as low as his tolerance for clingy women. To Liam, no woman would take a bullet for a man who didn't love her, but Davina had done that for his friend in the camp, and since then, he had thought she was the one for Neil. Though he knew that Neil might be interested in this girl for some reason other than affection, he would fall dead if his short-tempered friend were to fall in love. He didn't like the idea of him letting the girl into his home. Not to forget, Liam had been asked by Davina to make Neil learn to love her back as she planned to confess to him when she returned to the country. Neil, who heard Liam's question about why Mia was in his home, didn't answer. She was here because he had asked her to wait for him and she obeyed his words. However, he wasn't going to tell that to Liam. Thus, he calmly said, "There is no need for you to assist me tonight. You can go home." Liam, who was waiting for an answer about the girl, momentarily forgot and immediately beamed in relief to hear that he wouldn't have to pull off an all-nighter with Neil. He stood up to leave as he had been eager to find himself sleeping on his bed at home, but then he sat back down again as he realized Neil hadn't explained to him why the girl was here. Could it be that his ever-so-serious friend had finally decided to have fun alongside his work? Well, if he was only interested in the girl for a casual fling, then he had nothing against it. With those thoughts, Liam beamed and stood up again. He picked up his car keys and jacket, then turned to look at Neil, who was now trying to remove the girl's hand from around his arm. "Don't forget to use protection, man. The last thing you want to happen is to get a student pregnant. That won't only ruin the mission, but your reputation. You wouldn't want." The rest of the words stuck in his throat when Neil's seething eyes snapped towards him, shutting him up because the sleeping girl had suddenly stirred in her sleep and frowned as if about to wake up. Neil's lips pressed into a tight, angry line as he fiercely glared at Liam, who he had asked to leave but continued to say shit to him, and now the woman on his couch was going to wake up. The last thing he wanted was for Mia to see Liam's face. Only a few people in the country didn't know who Liam Thompson was after he modeled for some magazine years ago about military attire. Neil wasn't ready to strangle the girl to death if she were to find out about his identity, because that would be the only option he would have if she woke up to see Liam. His identity, staying hidden, was more important than his little curiosity and interest in her. With his eyes still glaring daggers at Liam, who wasn't leaving and still standing there like he was waiting to be told again, Neil spoke in a sharp whisper, "Get the fuck out of here before she wakes up." Liam didn't wait to be told twice. He raised his hands in surrender, then winked at his angry friend before he turned on his heels and rushed out of the apartment. Immediately the door clicked locked behind him, Mia's eyes fluttered open, and she quickly jumped into a sitting position upon noticing a silhouette hovering over her. "Ah!" She let out a small scream when a strand of her hair got tangled with the person's glimmering wristwatch as she tried to move away from him but ended up pulling her scalp along with his hand. "Ouch!" Mia cried out again as she pulled at her hair, but then stopped when a large, masculine hand covered hers to stop her from pulling at the hair. Before she could look up, his deep, smooth voice spoke beside her ear, sending a shiver down her spine, causing the hairs on the nape of her neck to stand at attention. "You are going to wound your scalp if you keep pulling it like that. Remove your hand. Let me take a look," he said in a deep whisper. She hadn't realized he was leaning so closely to her until his warm breath fell on her neck, making her realize where she was and question how she got here. Instinctively, Mia tried to move back from him as he leaned in to untangle her hair. How could she have fallen asleep waiting for him to return? She hadn't intended to even lie down, but she had felt so exhausted after dealing with that rude fashion assistant who had insulted her. She could still remember the woman's pleading voice as she asked her not to report her attitude to the fashion house CEO. It had taken quite a lot of effort to send the woman out of the apartment with her lackeys and designer clothes. Then afterwards, Mia remembered turning on the big screen TV to pass time. She had put the channel on her favorite K-drama channel and had fallen asleep anticipating the protagonists to share their first kiss. She hadn't even gotten to see it as the day's exhaustion had taken a toll on her body. She had fallen asleep dreaming of her own kiss with this same man, who was now trying to untangle her hair. I thought I heard another person's voice in my sleep. Is someone else in your house?" Mia meekly questioned while trying to avoid his gaze as he finished entangling her hair and stood straight to look down at her with a frown. She didn't want to meet his eyes because it reminded her of his lips against hers. Earlier before she woke up, she had heard voices in her sleep but couldn't hear what was being said. Neil, who heard her question, raised an eyebrow. It turned out the girl wasn't completely lost in her dream world. However, he had expected her to rush up and ask him to take her home immediately she noticed she was still in his house at this time of the night, but it seemed she hadn't realized the lateness yet and was still curious about who was speaking with him. When Mia didn't hear him reply, she slowly lifted her head to look towards him, only to be met with him raising his hand. She instinctively shut her eyes and shrunk backwards. But in the end, he only flicked her forehead. "Why do you always look terrified whenever I raise my hand?" Neil asked in a nonchalant, uninterested tone, but in his mind he was curious about that. She hadn't done it once but 3 times, like she feared he would hit her. Mia's eyes snapped open after realizing he hadn't raised his hand to hit her but to flick her forehead, something he seemed to like doing to her lately. The fear of someone raising their hands in front of her had already been imprinted in her mind. She always gets terrified if someone were to lift their hands. She had been hit in her nightmares by an unidentified person that had been haunting her for as long as she could remember, and it felt so real every time she woke up from it. It used to traumatize her in the past more than it did now. There was once a time she almost fainted when a man had raised his hand in front of her. However, she had never shared her fear of it with anyone, and she wasn't going to share it with her professor either. "It's nothing," she murmured softly while hugging her midriff and looking everywhere but his face, as she could feel his intense gaze boring a hole on her head while he towered over her on the couch. Her eyes suddenly fell on the glass walls and she noticed how dark it was outside. "Oh my, for how long have I been asleep?" She hastily tried to get up to look for her bag, but was suddenly pulled back by Neil. Chapter 90. Stop moving. Mia, who was suddenly pulled back by Neil, gasped as she found herself being pulled down along with him onto the couch. She quickly tried to stand up, but he swiftly grabbed her waist with both hands and made her sit on his lap in a way she was straddled on his lap, with her hands resting on his firm shoulders in surprised disbelief. Her face was only an inch away from his, she could feel his warm breath against her face. Her heart throbbed faster against her ribs as if it would burst out of her chest, and her face was quick to heat up as she felt his hold tighten around her waist when she made an attempt to stand up from his lap. She frowned and looked up into his eyes, only to regret doing so as she was met with his stern, penetrating, intense gray eyes. His expression was blank. It gave away nothing about his thoughts as he looked into her eyes as if he was trying to search for something, making her a little self-conscious again. "Let go of me. I need to leave," she said in annoyance, trying to wiggle out of his hold and slip away from his lap, but he pinned her back down on his lap with so much ease and then gritted his teeth. "Stop moving, Harrison. You are not going anywhere today until you answer all of the questions I have for you. Now be a good girl and sit still," he warned calmly, but his eyes were implacable as he glared down at her. Didn't she know her little movements were making something else react between his thighs? Foolish girl, he wasn't going to let her go tonight until he had fed his curiosity. He would not be seeing her anymore after tonight, and he wanted to know a few things about her. Mia, who saw the glare in his eyes, stopped trying to move again. She sat still, so still she was holding her breath so she wouldn't inhale his intoxicating scent that was now swirling around her because of their proximity. She unconsciously dug her nails into his shoulders as she felt him tug at her waist to adjust her on his lap. After he made sure that she was straddled on his lap completely and he was holding her in a way she wouldn't slip away, he lightly smacked her lower back, making her gasp in shock. But before she could speak, he cut her off with, "Breathe. I am not about to kill you. Look how red your face is because you're holding your breath." As his deep, husky voice caressed her forehead, a tingling warmth danced down her abdomen, leaving her momentarily spellbound at the foreign sensation. She had indeed been holding her breath until he hit her, but she was supposed to get mad at the fact that he hit her butt so casually like it was a normal thing, not to say the fact that he was even forcing her to sit in such an inappropriate position with him in spite of them not having any relationship. However, she wasn't mad but was instead feeling shy and thrilled at the feel of his strong arm around her waist. What kind of questions did he want to ask her that couldn't wait until they meet again? Sitting in such a position was making her unable to even think properly. She could tell it was late with how the city view looked like from the glass walls. "Mr. Bennett, I really should get going. My mother will." she said while trying to get off his lap again but stopped. A frown settled between her forehead as she began to feel something hard poke her thighs. She then looked down. There is something hard in your trousers," she murmured innocently as she tried to move away from whatever was in his trousers that was poking her, but a low, raw groan roared out of his chest as his hands dug into her waist and pinned her down directly on the thing poking her thigh. His eyes looked 3 shades darker as he looked at her. "Try to move one more time," he warned with a low, savage, strained voice, "and I will make sure to make you tame the beast you are awaking down there." Mia felt a shiver run down her spine at his warning that fell directly against her ears. However, she frowned in confusion as his words settled into her head and asked, "A beast? What kind of a thing are you keeping in your trousers that's poking me like that? If you want me to remain still, take the thing away. It's distracting." She muttered the last part softly as if to herself. She had never sat on a man's lap, nor did she know anything about how a man's body reacts because she was completely inexperienced when it came to anything that has to do with sexuality. And to her, she believed he must have put something in his pocket that bulged to the center and was now poking her thighs. She had no idea it was something else. Neil, who was using every little self-control he could muster to not flip their position and make her lie beneath him, was taken aback at her innocent words. For a moment, he stared at her curious eyes looking down to see what was poking her thighs, before he threw his head back and let out a roar of amused laughter that reached his eyes for the first time in ages, startling Mia into jumping slightly at the deep, rich sound that rumbled in his chest. If any of his soldiers or even Liam were to see or hear this sound of his genuine laughter, they wouldn't have believed their unemotional, short-tempered general had any genuine humor in him. Because even Neil himself couldn't remember the last time he allowed himself to laugh like this until now. Mia stared at his face as his laughter began to subside. She had never heard his genuine laughter before. It sounded deep and rich, making the side of his eyes wrinkle in humor. He looked younger than he appeared when he laughed, with a white, perfect set of teeth. However, when he caught her staring at him, he stopped laughing completely, but his silver eyes still had amusement dancing in them as he asked, "How old are you, little kitten?" Mia pursed her lips. "Louie, why do you ask?" He flicked her forehead once again. Then he leaned down to whisper in her ear, "Answer my question, Harrison. How old are you not to know about what the thing poking you is?" He moved back to see how her cheeks flushed red as if finally realizing what he meant. She then looked to the side as if too embarrassed to look at him. Neil clicked his tongue at how innocent she was and how her innocent behavior was making him act out of his character. No woman had ever had the privilege of sitting on his lap or invaded his personal space like he had allowed himself with this girl. Mia, on the other hand, was too embarrassed to even look at him again. She felt heat rush to her face at the realization of what was there. How did she even end up sitting on this big, bad wolf's lap? She wished to disappear forever. She sat still to make sure she wouldn't disturb the thing poking her between her thighs again. However, she couldn't ignore it completely. Neil, who saw how she kept her head turned to the side, removed one arm from around her waist and used his index finger to turn her chin towards him so she could look at him. But she refused to look at him. He then said with his authoritative tone, "Look at me, chica." His whispered commanding words wrapped around her with a raw, penetrating feeling that made her toes involuntarily curl up and her head automatically turned towards him. She lost her voice for a second as she noticed his eyes trailing down to the fullness of her lips. She wanted to turn away, but he still held her chin in place. What is the meaning of chica?" she asked curiously as she glanced up at his eyes. He had called her that just now, and she had no idea what it meant. Neil released her chin and returned his arm around her waist as he smirked. "It means young woman in Spanish, gatita curiosa." He told her the meaning while also calling her a curious kitten, but he immediately regretted using his language as he had given away to her that he knew how to speak Spanish. "You know how to speak Spanish?" Mia asked, with her brown eyes glistening in wonderment as she looked at him. "Is that why you know Mr. Galvera? It must be awesome to know how to speak another language. Did you communicate in Spanish with Mr. Galvera?" she asked him while momentarily forgetting she was sitting on his lap, as whenever she was curious, she became carried away. She had been dying to get any opportunity to make this ice cube talk about his meeting with Xavier Galvera. However, he burst her bubbles again by putting on his no-nonsense expression and glancing at her seriously. "You never miss an opportunity to get what you want, do you, Just like the nosy journalist you are. He chided, his voice laced with irritation. Mia pursed her lips and glared at him. Why are you such a short-tempered man? You take things too seriously. Scowling too much will make you age faster than your age. She poked his shoulder as she spoke, but he grabbed her wrist and glared at her, making Mia gulp in nervousness. You are indeed brave, chica. Do you know I can snap your neck and dispose of your body with no one knowing about it? He whispered dangerously close to her ear while trailing his hand up to her neck, making Mia unconsciously jump in fear. Neil smirked when he noticed the wariness in her eyes. It turned out there was a part of her that was wary of him. He thought, liking the idea of her being wary. He then changed the topic to the main question he had wanted to ask her. Tell me, chica, why are you so insecure about yourself and scared every time I raise my hand?